Hello there, and welcome to this, the 226th edition of DF Direct Weekly, but our first as a fully independent media outlet. Hugely exciting. I just want to actually pick up on the response to our announcement that we did a couple of days back, announcing that we're now fully creator-owned and independent. But before I do that, I should introduce the panel for this direct. Joining me, first of all, Oliver Mackenzie. Hello.
Yes, Rich. Happy Independence Day. Very good movie. Hopefully an even better turn for Digital Foundry here.
Yes, awesome movie. Alex Battaglia, hello.
So, am I Bill Pullman? Who's Brent Spiner in this Independence Day panel that we've got here? Can I be Will Smith?
You can.
I don't know if I want to be modern Will Smith, but 90s Will Smith? Yeah, that sounds cool.
I just want to actually say something in response to the feedback to our announcement. Just completely overwhelmed, basically. We are now fully independent. We are now creator-owned, essentially. Yesterday, after we released the announcement video, it was just like awesome to see the reaction from the audience and from our contacts in the games business. I was just trying to keep up with all of the comments on Patreon and Discord and the emails that were rolling in when my wife was following the comments posted on YouTube. It's just like a complete sort of avalanche, like a tidal wave of positivity. So yeah, a heartfelt thanks for that. It's such a payoff after a process that's been a lot more involved than you might realize, when you think about it. I mean, sort of behind the scenes negotiation with IGN on making the deal happen, figuring out how on earth it's possible to pay for this. We needed a legal team to handle the transaction. It's a lot of work, but, it's just the beginning of a transition phase that we're in now, because we've been integrated with Gamer Network for over a decade at this point. So while the deal's now done, there's a whole new range of challenges. De-integration, it's a very real thing. There's a lot of sort of IGN/Gamer Network systems we need to port ourselves out of. Businessy stuff, hiring accountants, day-to-day stuff like actually paying people, commercial representation. Historically, we've not been very good at that, but now we have the opportunity to pick and choose who we want to work with, who's going to represent us to the wider industry, and what it is we actually want to achieve there. I think, Alex, that video you did recently, the Doom video, the sponsored video with NVIDIA there, was actually sort of the kind of things that we'd really like to do going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kind of pushing that idea of, for at least for retro content, celebrating a specific game within the context of a series or within the context of how it pertains to the hardware of the time, and showing how it runs and telling the story like John would over a long period of time. I would love to do that for more stuff, and that is the kind of stuff we could do, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. There's just so much potential there. But, going forward, there's a huge amount of admin and foundational work to get sorted. But rest assured that as far as the sort of day-to-day outputs of the channel are concerned, the team has you covered. We're still going to be producing the same amount of work, hopefully more of it. And obviously, a couple of weeks from now, we've got Gamescom to contend with, and myself, John and Alex will be there. And then we can kind of continue the process of figuring out what we're able to do, when we can do it, and how much we can push. But just, the response, the supporter response on Patreon, the kind comments, the feedback we've had from the industry, just thanks for everything. It's really meant the world. It's sort of like the ultimate payoff after what's been a pretty sort of intensive period for me personally. So thank you so much. But with that, I think we should return to the world of gaming and technology news for this particular direct. So let's crack on with our first news topic. Okay, so this one's quite interesting. Moore's Law is dead. The leaks are continuing, this time with news on purported PlayStation 6 silicon, codenamed Orion. Lots of response from our audience about this, lots of questions. And I think, basically we should just talk about the stuff that has been leaked. Codenamed Orion, Zen 6 CPU architecture. There's talk of 40 to 48 RDNA 5 compute units. clocked at over 3 gigahertz, G7 memory, 160-bit or 192-bit bus. Total board power 160 watts, lower than PlayStation 5's to 190 to 220 watts. Also some performance approximations, 3 times the rasterization performance of the PlayStation 5, RT performance potentially 5 to 10 times higher due to RDNA 5 architectural improvements. And it will have full backwards compatibility with PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5. So, Oliver, I don't know what to make of this, because this looks like a sort of specification for an APU that's going to be coming sooner rather than later. Mm-hmm. And I think if we go back to what the last sort of official word, if you like, from Sony on this, it came from Mark Cerny himself, basically saying, yep, RDNA 5, AMD's going flat out. That's going to happen sooner rather than later. And we're going to be taking, or rather Sony is going to be taking, a multi-year approach, which kind of suggests that this is going to be much further on down the road. I mean, here we are in the year of our Lord 2025, and 2027, 2028, a lot can happen in that time period. I don't know what your take is on that.
Yeah, it's not totally clear to me exactly what will happen. I kind of tend to think that 2027 is a reasonable time frame for a console like this, but I could also see it slipping into 2028 or something like that, just depending on what Sony has to offer here. This looks like pretty much very similar to what Microsoft is offering in a lot of respects, just with slightly less CUs on the GPU side of things, a little bit of some differences in the CPU side. On the Sony side, you have 8 Zen 6 cores. On the Microsoft side, apparently you have 3 Zen 6 cores and 8 Zen C cores. A little bit of a difference there. The memory interfaces and probably the amount of memory in both devices as a result would probably be fairly similar, you'd imagine, with both devices speculated to be using 192-bit memory buses potentially. And then in terms of that GPU, you do have some difference there, but it's not like they do seem of a kind with each other, and they do seem similar in ways that would suggest a sooner release date to me, potentially based off this information, than a release date that would be into 2028 or something like that, as Mark Cerny has kind of hinted at in very broad strokes, like you said. But it's important to mention here that this is like information that came from a presentation to Sony, rather, I should say, from AMD, that apparently occurred 2 years ago. So plans can change. And also this is information that comes from one source. Kepler L2 has confirmed that he's heard similar things in terms of the broad perspective on this, but not in terms of the nitty-gritty spec details. So a lot could change, but I would definitely agree that from at least Mark's phrasing, it seemed like he was trying to differentiate the Sony effort and then RDNA 5, or as he called it, whatever AMD is calling the next generation graphics. he was not too up on that naming scheme necessarily, but I think there is a bit of a conflict there, but exactly how that will be resolved, I don't know. To me, this looks like a reasonable offering for next generation console, but it's also an offering that is by its nature 2 years out of date, right? So a lot can change between now and then.
I mean, there are some things that I do think ring true on here, like, for example, aiming for a $500 price point kind of makes sense for a console. The concept of it being efficiency driven, total board power. I'm curious if it would actually be lower than PlayStation 5's. I guess that is going to depend quite a lot on what the nature is of RDNA 5.
Could be a little optimistic too on AMD's side of things.
That sounds really, just to butt in, to just look at the 9070 XT and its total wattage. When attached to an SoC, thinking about lower clocks, you're still there's still like a whole CPU on there. There's the memory, there's the SSD and controllers. It does sound a little bit optimistic for me, and I would actually imagine it to be kind of a higher power device like the original PlayStation 5 was for its time of release, if it does maintain these specs.
Right. Yeah, we have actually seen across the sort of direction of travel is that consoles are becoming more power demanding from generation to generation. PlayStation 5 Pro kind of similar to PS4 Pro in that it consumed much the same amount of power as the base unit, but did it via a die shrink. So yeah, I don't know. I still think it's probably going to be in the sort of 200 watt area. It just kind of makes sense. I think that there's a big question mark here, which is we just don't know what RDNA 5 is. There have been some talk about 3x rasterization performance versus PlayStation 5. I don't know. Again, this, Oliver, you talked to Mark Cerny about this, and, basically we're obviously paraphrasing here, but it seemed to be the case that rasterization boosts probably aren't going to be that much of a revelatory thing going forward. And the emphasis is moving more towards ray tracing and machine learning.
Well, especially when you look at the context of like the PlayStation 5 Pro only having a rasterization boost as we measure it across a variety of games of 30% at best, like 35 or 40%.
Right.
Certainly, achieving easily 2 times the rasterization of a PlayStation 5 Pro, 3 times the rasterization of a PlayStation 5 as has been reported here would be a huge leap. And I wouldn't even, to me, that does not seem like the central focus of any next generation console. It seems like the central focus of any next generation console would be having great machine learning acceleration, would be having much improved RT acceleration, would be having this cavalcade of features, right? And would be less about achieving some multiple of the last generation console's performance. In my head, considering the PlayStation 6, I really didn't think a 3x multiple would be the case here. I thought maybe like a 2x multiple or something like that. It seems like a very ambitious design for a console, especially a console that's apparently a $500 price tag. I think that's quite ambitious for this level of performance, especially when you consider like the kinds of GPUs in this category on the PC side are like $1,000 GPUs, right? And then you combine out the CPU, memory. This is a pretty compelling device if they can indeed hit that price point and this level of performance, especially within like a reasonable power envelope. That's pretty incredible, I think.
What do you think, Alex?
I agree with Oliver, and I could just give an example of that. So rasterization is tapped out largely in regards to how it scales. So when you double your rasterization power, you're taking either the same thing and running at 2x the frame rate, maybe, or you're doubling the size of whatever you're doing. Maybe you're doubling the triangle count of an object. You are doubling the textures in one scene. Maybe the bandwidth is allowing you to throw 2x particles in front of the screen in one moment. Honestly, the visual payback that you get for doing that is a lot smaller than when you increase how much more ray tracing you can do, especially at this nascent stage in ray tracing development. Because if you go from little to no ray tracing acceleration like you see in the PlayStation 5 to massively multiplying it by, what was the numbers quoted there? Was it 5? 3 to 5? 5 to 10 times. You're moving from a game having at most maybe something like ray tracing shadows to adding in multiple ray tracing effects at that one point in time at the same frame rate. And the visual impact of increasing that part of the acceleration is so much larger to the end image. And I think that's really what Mark Cerny gets at the end of the day, where the scaling for what you get back visually by increasing stuff like ROP throughput and, texture fetching and all these things, they are so much smaller for the consumer's visual experience than increasing things that are new frontiers of rendering, which still have a lot of place to grow and optimization to occur, unlike the 35 years or whatever we have of rasterization being grown and optimized. So I really do think actually this rumor of the 3x rasterization seems a little bit incredible. And at the same time, it seems like, but why would they focus on that is my question, when it seems like it's counter narrative to what Mark Cerny talked about.
That's kind of my take on it as well. I guess there were a lot of caveats that Oliver talked about in terms of when this information was actually circulating. It's enough to say, well, actually, they could have settled on a completely different approach. And it does seem that there are certain discrepancies in terms of that information and what Mark Cerny's actually said. And I think if you look at the design of the PlayStation 5 Pro, it's pretty clear what the direction of travel is. When you looked at 4 to 4 Pro, it was essentially just doubling of GPU, right? Mm-hmm. And that's not really what we saw with the 5 Pro. It was something more interesting, I think. It was kind of like a foundational project for what's going to be happening in the future. And I think that's what we're going to be seeing, right? And I think it's similarly the case with whatever Microsoft's planning. Their biggest console leap ever isn't going to be powered exclusively by, compute units or whatever. It's actually more in terms of features and machine learning. We've just really begun to see what machine learning is doing on that respect. We're still on that sort of Wild West frontier, so to speak. Nevertheless, all of these rumors that have circulated have brought about a wealth of supporter questions, which I think we should take a look at. This one from Bulbous_Bow. Bravo and congratulations on your independence! The source of the new Xbox and PS6 rumors, Moore's Law is dead, suggested that the Xbox may be targeting 5080 levels of performance, PS6 around 20 to 30% below this. He speculates that both consoles should be sufficient to max out 4K 120Hz TVs with a good level of ray tracing support, obviously factoring in upscaling. I'm curious, would this accord with your experience of this class of hardware? What do you think and do you think it likely that the Xbox can justify the cost of the extra silicon, never mind that it might not be subsidized, with a qualitatively better experience? What can we say about this one? This one from Concrete Llama, wishing you a merry independence time_unit, a day, a month, a year, I don't know, and a happy rest of the year. So there have been some rumors about PS6 being roughly equivalent to a 9070 XT and the next Xbox equivalent to a 5080. Is it just me or is that mildly disappointing?
Wow.
We were told to expect a massive generational leap, but well, I have a 5080. I think it's great and delivers far better performance than a Series X or PS5. I'd hardly call it a massive generational leap. The 5080 is high-end now, but it won't be by the time the consoles come out.
Well, I already want to say something, if I may.
Yes, say something, Alex. This is the purpose of a show discussing the latest gaming and technology news.
Well, when the comparison between a 9070 XT and a 5080, I feel a little bit odd. Because a 5080 is much more actually capable than a 9070 XT in key areas that are important in terms of software feature set. You do have all the ray reconstruction, multi-frame gen stuff that currently isn't there on the AMD side of things. But you also, when you do, so if you maybe play these two GPUs in rasterization, you see this 20 to 30% deficit that the user is talking about here and everyone keeps talking about. But as soon as you turn on a game that is a next generation offering with path tracing, you actually see that these GPUs are very different. So I don't actually like this GPU comparison between the two consoles using a 5080 and a RX 9070 XT because it kind of misses the entire point of transformational technologies that you see on the NVIDIA side that still have yet to enter on the AMD side of things. And if you do look at an RTX 5080 and you compare it, like an RTX 5080 can run path trace Cyberpunk 4K output targeting 120 FPS, and you compare that to the visual output of the PlayStation 5 version, to me, that actually does look next generationally different in a lot of ways. So I actually wouldn't discount the idea of an RTX 5080 being a transformational experience for someone who only has a base console.
Yeah.
So I agree entirely. Yeah, it's like very, very different.
Yeah.
Well,
I think defining a console generation by the standards of current generation software is always misleading. Because if you look at early period like PS3 or PS4, even PS5 software, that's not maximizing the console. So just saying I took this rasterized game on PS5 and I ran it at 4K 120. Is that really a next generation experience? It's well, you're just kind of question begging. That's not really going to be the case with any generation of console software. But I would say that in terms of the 5080 9070 XT comparison, Kepler is saying this is the biggest generational transformation since GCN on the AMD side. He says it's going to have all the features of Blackwell and then some. He's really saying this is going to be a transformational architecture in RDNA 5, even more perhaps than RDNA 4 was. So, by his standards, at least, it will be apparently, relatively capable in ray tracing, relatively capable in path tracing compared to extant AMD architecture. So, at least in that context, again, this is all operating off of information that we don't really have an independent way of verifying ourselves. Then it should be a pretty capable machine.
Yeah, but there is still this move to a different paradigm, really. That's the bottom line, isn't it? Everybody is now sort of focused on replicating the current NVIDIA machine learning feature set, and rightly so, because there's some fantastic stuff going on there. But this is just the beginning, right? Obviously, NVIDIA aren't going to be standing still. There's going to be new innovations. We've seen some of them at CES this year. And, the concept of having what you might consider at that point base level hardware that's capable of embracing all of these features fully, I think is hugely exciting. And the more developer take up you get, the more deeply integrated it is into the way games are made. I think it is going to be like a proper generational leap. I mean, you're quite right, Alex. I mean, the 5080 is, I think it's probably like closer more to 200 frames per second with path-based Cyberpunk. And
with MFG, I forgot about MFG. I was just doing
because,
FG in my brain there. Not even
frame generation is going to be a thing, right? Yeah. And obviously, this is the other thing, of course, all of this discussion about maxing out a 4K 120 hertz TV. I think it all really depends on how many people are actually using 120 hertz TVs at that point. I think we're sort of also potentially moving away from the fact that how can I say it? The console experience is very, very different to a PC experience. The demands of the audience are very, very different. It's why, certainly from the last generation, 30 FPS was fine on a console, and you'd go to PC for those higher frame rate experiences. Mm-hmm. I think with this generation, we've kind of moved on to the expectation that 60 frames per second is where things need to be. But the difference in experience in something like, let's say, The Last of Us, between 60 and 120, I can fully see developers still doubling down on fidelity at 60 rather than going full out for 120. But, I guess the question is at that point, the extent to which, frame generation is considered part of the overall design, or basically a value add to produce a 120 hertz mode. I mean, this is the whole thing about this, and I think you're quite right in terms of the way the discussion's rolled out, Alex, which is to say that there's this massive change in the way games are going to be created that's going to happen within the next few years. And here we are talking about, hey, it's like a 9070 XT, which is a part that was never really designed for this new paradigm. And it is what RDNA 5 apparently is. So, yeah, I think, there's a lot of question marks and a lot of caveats about these specs at the moment. I think we need to be a bit cautious about taking them on board, because I saw some headlines saying PlayStation 6 specs confirmed. Basically that's not what the original leak was saying. Mm-hmm. But it is a spec that is out there, and it is kind of plausible. Interesting stuff. I don't really know where we're going to go from this, except to say that there's a long process ahead of us as we move into the next generation. Probably going to see more stuff from Microsoft first, I'd say, based on Mark Cerny's comments about a multi-year schedule. Mm-hmm. And we'll see what happens there and how they come to define what a generational leap actually is. But I think, we are seeing change. We are seeing machine learning taking point. We are seeing technologies like frame generation. There's a stronger focus on that. I actually saw this week that FSR Redstone seems to be on track for happening this year, which is great news, because again, it's all about consolidating these kind of next generation features and standardizing them and making sure that no GPU owner is kind of locked out of that. The process is ongoing, I'd say. Okay, but there have been more leaks, Oliver, specifically about the PlayStation handheld, a rumored companion device to the PlayStation 6 home console. What's kind of happening there?
Yeah, so apparently it's this little monolithic die with, on the CPU side, apparently they're going to go with, at least this is part of the AMD proposal, 4 Zen 6C cores, which is interesting. It's a smaller core count than any existing Zen 5 design, to my knowledge. But I suppose for this device, they would consider a lower core count, in part because I would presume they would probably be primarily targeting 30 FPS in the software that they're going to run on this device. On the GPU side of things, they're talking about 12 to 20 CUs potentially in the design, but Kepler_L2 has already stated a few times that he expects it will have 16 CUs based off of his leaks from different documentation. So I'd presume that would still be true for this, and of course that falls within the middle of this range. So those two details are quite consistent. On the memory side, I'm a little bit surprised actually, because there's no LPDDR6 in this spec, surprisingly. Which is a shame, as that would have much higher speeds. LPDDR6, I presume, is a little bit too far away. They're talking about LPDDR5X 7500 or greater in this spec leak. LPDDR5X 8533 megatransfers per second is the very highest spec of LPDDR5X, and that would be equivalent to 137 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. So that would be an upper bound for this device. If you go over to LPDDR6 memory, that top end of the spec could potentially go up to 230 gigabytes per second in its highest initial configuration, which is 14,400 megatransfers per second memory. But of course, in context, this is with a device that probably has a much, definitely has a much smaller display, has a 1080p display in all likelihood, is not going to be targeting 4K 60, maybe is going to be targeting 1080p 30. And in that context, this spec leak would make a lot more sense in terms of actually targeting realistic visuals for device of that capability. There are some other hardware details as well, apparently, in this leak, like a USB Type-C video out. That's a big deal for us, obviously.
Yes.
Haptic vibration, which is what you'd expect from Sony given their focus on the DualSense controller this generation. Dual mics, a touchscreen, hopefully an OLED touchscreen there. Probably also with 120 hertz and VRR technologies. I'd expect that to be part of the spec as well, especially if it's an LCD. And they're also talking about a micro SD slot and an M.2 SSD slot, which is kind of surprising. I just presume they would go with the M.2 SSD, but apparently there's going to be a mix of storage technologies, at least in the proposal, there's a mix of storage technologies. And then a 15-watt TBP, which is probably a realistic upper bound for what Sony would end up targeting with a device like this if you want more than like a couple hours of battery life, or if you want it to be reasonably slim and reasonably light for a device like this. So I think this looks interesting. It's kind of they're making slightly different choices than the other makers of handhelds are with the Strix Point APU. In part, I think because Strix Point is not really designed primarily for handhelds. It's designed primarily for laptops. So this has a smaller CPU. It has a bigger GPU in all likelihood when you consider the size of those RDNA 5 CUs. It has a similar memory interface. The performance target they're going for here is a higher performance target for rendering than those existing extant Strix Point devices. They're talking about Series S level, roughly Series S level, or in MLID's leak here, they're phrasing it as 0.5x PS5 level, which is about at that Series S level of capability. But then, of course, in terms of ray tracing, in terms of machine learning, you'd have that additional level of capability probably above and beyond that 0.5x spec, right? If we're talking about a much higher multiple potentially for ray tracing, or actually having some capability to do machine learning, which would be important for next generation PSSR in this kind of device. So I think it's an interesting leak. Again, you take it with a grain of salt based on the fact that there's not a variety of sourcing in this leak, and based on the fact that it is at least a couple years old relative to the current time. So those are some caveats here. But I think it's an interesting leak, and it suggests a device that is probably quite performant, but is also within the realm of kind of current generation memory technologies. But it is pushing out this more advanced GPU architecture, which should make a big difference.
I think, the lesson learned from Switch 2 is that bespoke optimization for a specific architecture actually does yield benefits. And secondly, the importance of DLSS on Switch 2 has kind of again highlighted the importance of machine learning components in there as well. The only real surprise from my perspective is the 4 Zen cores, Zen 6C cores from that, bearing in mind if you're looking for easy porting of games from PlayStation 5, for example, that's quite a lot of computational grunt you might be losing. Because, of course, it's a whole new architecture that's significantly better than Zen 2, but at the same time, the target apparently for this is a 15-watt APU. So, yeah, those cores are going to have to be
bigger.
They're not going to be. It's not going to be like for like, I don't think. What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, that's the one. The whole the only wrinkle in this for me. I think GPU wise, the scaling is going to be nice, kind of like we see with the handhelds. But as soon as you reduce that amount of cores available to the game, and those games on PS5 have been targeting, was it like 6.5, 7 cores or something like that? Because there's also system reservation you have to consider. That's another thing.
The
other
thing, of course.
With the Switch,
what's going to happen with system reservation on a quad-core processor?
That doesn't sound nice from my perspective. Whatever it is, so that's why I'm wondering if this is really the spec then in the end that they would go with versus another proposal. But it does seem like I would prefer maybe even smaller GPU and a larger CPU just to head up those areas where games are going to be targeting 60 FPS, etc.
It is a little bit suspicious too, just because of how area efficient those Zen 5C cores are at the moment, because they have so much less cache than the Zen 5 full fat cores. Assuming that trend held true for the Zen 6 generation of products, I'd presume that 8 Zen 6C cores would not break the area bank in terms of actually having that chip be reasonable.
I mean, the concept of a Sony handheld, I mean, there's pedigree there. The Vita, never quite landed where it should, but ultimately it was, a completely different class of product to what Sony was developing at the time. I think what's quite interesting with this is obviously it's going to be components of the same lineage as the main PlayStation, which should make cross-platform development similar to what's happening with Series S or versus Series X. Obviously, with PlayStation 6, the power gulf is probably going to be significantly wider. But, there's this whole library of PlayStation 5 games that could conceivably come across. And yeah, again, let's not go into the whole power saver PS5 thing. We did that a couple of weeks ago. But let's just say I'm going to be very interested to see how that power saver manifests on actual shipping games once they are supported. But with that, let's move on. Okay, so a couple of games released this week which we weren't able to take a look at. I guess Mafia, the old country, just didn't receive a review code for some reason. We'll be taking a look at that when we can. Another game that did come out, Apex Legends on Switch 2, which looks quite intriguing, right, Oliver?
It does. And this is a game that actually surprised me quite a bit in terms of its quality this week. So I'm quite happy to talk about it here in this direct. So if we compare the Switch 2 version and the Switch 1 version here, the first thing that stands out is there's like a huge improvement in image quality, a pretty gargantuan improvement in image quality. As you might expect, that's not too surprising, but it is pretty special here. The original game clocked in at a dynamic 720p with TAA. That was Tom's measurement. It's also my measurement in this code as of the moment. And the Switch 2 counts in at 1080p in the shots I tested. And I think it's using a DLSS variant here because it doesn't resemble the TAA used in other versions of the game at all. And it has some DLSS-like characteristics. It looks much better than the old code. It's no longer blurry. It's easy to read visually, which is very important for a multiplayer shooter like this. There's minimal aliasing. It's just a dramatically better appearance. I don't think it's upsampling necessarily with DLSS, though, to a much higher resolution because it's not terribly sharp at all. It looks like a 1080p-like presentation, and the UI also appears like a 1080p-like UI here. Then there are a ton of settings upgrades on top of that, so there are better quality, better filtered soft shadows here, much higher grade textures. There's good SSAO that is used extensively for the game's indirect lighting. There's extra ground clutter, there's more foliage, and the foliage that is there animates, whereas before it was totally static. There's better draw distances, and there's better reflections that use cube maps more extensively. There's no SSR here, or certainly anything more exotic or exciting like ray tracing. We're still waiting for that implementation on Switch to occur here, but overall it's a stunning visual difference. And then in terms of performance, on Switch 1, it targeted only 30 FPS and it often missed it. It would tend to struggle, especially at this beginning of matches when you're kind of flying down in that big aerial formation. It really kind of collapsed the performance there. Combat could also be a big problem. Again, this game has like huge matches, 60-player matches. It was not performing too well at all times there. Switch 2 is nearly a lock 60 FPS in comparison. The only exceptions are like at the beginning of the match, it would drop down to like, the 40s and 50s, nothing too bad. There'd be some one-off frame drops during matches as well, but nothing too bad at all. It was generally a lock 60 FPS, which is really important, obviously, in that docked output. Compared to Series S, I was even more surprised when I looked at Series S because it looks very similar to Series S. The biggest visual difference by far has got nothing to do with the game settings. It's just a difference in gamma. So the Switch 2 version is a little bit lighter for whatever reason. And if you darken those shadows in post-production, you can actually get them to match a little bit more, which is a little bit of a weird difference that we saw, I think, in the original Switch version as well. It's a little bit lighter than the existing home console versions of the game. There's some cutbacks in Switch 2, like there's less ground clutter, shadow resolution's lower, shadow pop-in's a little bit worse. Nothing too major here. And a lot is very similar, like pop-in for geometry, pop-in for models is quite similar. So there are a couple cutbacks, but I think the key change here comes down to image quality, where Switch 2 is just doing a much better job of actually resolving a clean and stable 1080p-like image. Both consoles are 1080p 60. The Series S also counts to 1080p, but the Switch 2 is just running a lot better here, looking a lot better in that 1080p 60 mode. The Series S also has a 120 hertz mode that I didn't have time to test that compromises a little bit more in resolution. And the Switch 2, in terms of 120 hertz support, it does not have any 120 hertz support whatsoever. So it's just a 60 hertz output only game. I also looked briefly at portable mode, and it runs really well at 60 FPS there as well. It does have VRR support, but the VRR appears to drop below 40 hertz or so. So at like the beginning of those big matches, I did feel it drop out of the VRR range quite noticeably there, but otherwise it's within the VRR range. The developers say it's going to 1008p, so just below 1080p, and it does look relatively 1080p-like, relatively sharp on the display. Internally, it's something like 720p is what I counted, so it is upsampling there to a high resolution, presumably using DLSS. So I was just as a bit of a takeaway, I was super surprised here and very pleased because Switch 2 is obviously pulling off much better visuals than Switch 1. That's no surprise. And it is a dramatic improvement. But the comparison to Series S was really quite something here. Series S is running a more demanding set of settings, obviously, but Switch 2 is arguably the preferable platform, at least in that 60 hertz mode, because it is pulling off much greater image quality, much better image quality along a number of axes with the use of DLSS. And I'm really pleased here. So I think this is a case where they're going back to a game that is a little bit older. Apex is a 6-year-old game. It's obviously based on the very, very old Source engine at this point. So maybe it's not the best barometer for the application of, current gen rendering tech necessarily. But it does look a lot better on Switch 2 than I think it has any right to, realistically, considering what they're trying to pull off here. It's quite impressive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what was the Series S versus Switch 2 pixel counts in the docked mode?
1080p flat on both. Now, of course, it's possible, and indeed probably likely based on the pedigree of the other versions, that the Switch 2 version might have DRS here, and that might be more aggressive than other versions, right? That's entirely possible here. But in terms of the pixel count, both were coming out at native 1080p.
It's pretty impressive, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the great thing about when a new console comes along, getting to grips with what it's actually capable of, because obviously in the pre-release period, you've got access to limited media and you've got, leaked specs, leaked developer documentation, that kind of thing. But at the same time, it's like, well, you don't really know what these things are truly capable of until you actually get shipping software in your hands. And that's where some surprises come up, right? I mean, obviously, going back in the day to like 2020, we were expecting the Series X to outperform the PlayStation 5 based on the specifications that were released. But it actually turns out there's a lot more to a console than just, how many compute units or it's got or its core clock frequency. There's particularly in a fixed platform environment for a console, it's just very, very different. And it's actual games that do the talking. I don't know what you think of these assets there, Alex.
Oh, it's interested from me to see the areas where it does dip below, and it kind of talks a little bit to the area we're probably going to see this generation where Switch 2 has its greatest challenges in the CPU area.
Yeah.
So that's always interesting to see from my perspective. It would be kind of fun to take that and translate that using like-for-like performance to a PC unit and kind of see, while jumping into a match, we can get the frame rate down to this. What PC CPU is that most similar to performance-wise in this exact moment? And I think we could actually chart that. And that's something that would be a fun video almost in its own right, to look at how we can chart what are most likely CPU-limited areas in games and Switch, and what is the most equivalent PC CPU that we can kind of put that against.
What I'd love to see is 3D Mark basically becoming console developers.
There's nothing actually stopping them.
I'm curious about that, right?
We should maybe send them a message one day, like, why don't you just release your benchmark on the people release, junkware all the time on the consoles that could do anything. Maybe they just feel like it's bad form or something like that.
Well, yeah, if you can produce a highly contentious, possibly illegal version of Wipeout for the Xbox.
Yeah, really, right? Like if you can do that, like why not just port a benchmark?
Of course, the stuff we've seen on the eShop, the shovelware part of the eShop, basically it seems to be the case that anything goes, right? Why not a nice bit of benchmarking software? That would be pretty awesome. But Apex Legends, it's great to see that game actually getting a really good port for Switch 2 there. And I'm going to say it again, and I must apologize, but at some point, yes, we will look at Fortnite on Switch 2. It's just things have been a bit busy at the moment. But I suspect there'll be some nice surprises there too, bearing in mind it's targeting 60 frames per second, but just have to wait and see. Okay, let's move on. Okay, interesting announcements this week from AMD. Alex, let's talk about the dense geometry format, because first thing I said to you in our Slack was basically, okay, I guess this is AMD's take on RTX mega geometry, which was a sentiment which a lot of people on social media picked up on and thought, okay, but that's not actually the case, is it?
No, it isn't actually the case necessarily. So they're both coming at the issue in similar. In there's a problem. Basically, what do you do with games that have a lot more triangles nowadays than they did in the past? And specifically, they really are looking at UE5 and how it has a lot more triangles potentially than games of the past. And RTX Mega Geometry's take on this is, okay, we know that they're splitting up they're heavily instancing aspects of the visual geometry there, and they're also splitting them up into tinier, well, not tinier, but larger gross units of clusters. And if we can stream in clusters for the ray tracing structure, much in the same way they stream in the clusters for the rasterization aspect, then we can make big wins in the granularity of the build times that are occurring for ray tracing, the build times of the individual acceleration structures. Because otherwise, when there would be a tiny little cluster that would change on a very large model due to the camera moving all the time, or the distance to the model changing, which is how nanite works, it's constantly switching in these new clusters, well then it would only be building a smaller portion of that. That was the CLAS, the cluster level acceleration structure. And there's also other aspects of the RTX Mega Geometry API that handle like large scale instancing that are interesting, which also fit really well actually into things that Nanite are doing. DGF is actually, I would almost call that complementary to what we are seeing in RTX Mega Geometry. I don't think they actually are mutually exclusive as far as my understanding is. DGF is saying, well, okay, to build these acceleration structures, we are currently inputting uncompressed geometry. You can actually compress geometry, but GPUs really haven't been doing that. And we've been dealing with compressed textures for so long, but geometry itself hasn't required compression to the same degree. But that can actually, that one disk size, VRAM size, as well as throughput of the geometry would be greatly enhanced if it could be compressed and decoded for the ray tracing structure. The thing is, that is essentially their proposal. And they brought out a Vulkan extension to allow this. And this should decrease build time. It's kind of like, imagine a big pipeline. And if you could imagine it, like where there's a big model at one end, and then you have the ray tracing at the other end occurring. AMD is tackling it at the front point of this pipeline, saying, oh, well, let's throw in less or more compressed geometry that has a similar quality level visually. And NVIDIA is saying, well, actually, let's attack it right here and start doing builds in a more granular way. And I actually think they could supplement each other in time with an architecture that would support both of them, which is wholly possible in the future. So they aren't actually competing technologies, but the competitive aspect of this is that the only people who've been working on this are AMD, of course, right? I don't think Intel and NVIDIA have a open spec compression format that they have that would be compatible with this at the moment, and that they would want to give out, and that they thought about giving out even. And as a result, AMD coming in with this and how we just talked about PS6. We've been talking about the next gen Xbox. The chances are very high that those systems will support it. In fact, if you look at the Vulkan On the GPU Open website, the blog they put out, they do say support for future architectures. Right now, the extension for Vulkan that they did put out, they have a screenshot of it. It's running on a 7900 XTX in the screenshot. That's not because it supports it in hardware. Rather, that is the kind of the software implementation of the idea. And it may not be completely real-time performant and useful for a game right now, but you can start getting your hands on it and working with it, which is a really good thing for the future of rendering. My personal take on this is that I want to see AMD pushing for better RT performance. I want to see the industry thinking about these things. But at the same time, I'm a little bit worried about like format wars, and I'm a little bit worried about like a slight, I don't know how to say, stifle of innovation that could occur potentially as a result of a format being adopted before all the other vendors try out something in their own right. Just because I always think about the original DXR spec, which I think has seen a lot of complaints from developers in the fact that it is very black boxy and less flexible than other aspects of the rendering that you can do on GPUs. But at the same time, that very broad and somewhat limited specification from the developer point of view allowed the hardware vendors, Intel, AMD, and NVIDIA, to do some really intense innovation behind the scenes and come up with different solutions to similar problems. And like requiring all of a sudden a specific geometry format, I don't know if that is the best way to take DirectX forward necessarily, but it could be a really great way to get acceleration on the console side of things, where they already have these proprietary formats and they're fine with sticking with them. So I'm very curious to see what this means for the future of the industry as a whole, whether or not Microsoft says DXR is now going to require DGF in the future, whether or not it actually stays only in console land for a while, because it's currently just a Vulkan extension, right? There's a lot of Vulkan extensions that never are brought over to mainline DirectX or even mainline Vulkan. And I'm curious to see how the other vendors react to this, because I don't think we would have a situation where the games developers would be shipping two sets of geometry formats for games. I don't see that as currently as a thing that would happen, but who knows? Or maybe if Intel and NVIDIA feel like this is a good thing and their future GPUs should just support DGF because they think it's so worthwhile regardless of any sort of politicking. So that is my take on it. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Platform wars, obviously, or format wars. Isn't that kind of what we've had already with NVIDIA essentially taking point on innovation, ray tracing?
Well, a little bit in terms of they might have had some dictation there in the original opening spec of DXR, hence why DXR 1.1 came out. But at the same time, since it was so broad and you could do anything, like they all have their own proprietary BVH formats, the only thing that is really required is the API itself, how the rays are accelerated, how the BVH is built, accelerated or not. Intel even added in like ray sorting and binning, etc., ray sorting, without any explicit support of SER, for example. There's a lot of things that could be done within that spec that I thought was actually kind of brilliant for at least a beginning part of a new way to do rendering. And I actually liked the fact that it was kind of broad open. But yeah, it's always kind of there in the background. These IHVs are probably always fighting over these little intricacies. But I always feel like, maybe we're at that part where actually the industry decides kind of like USB and USB-C, like, let's stop this and let's just rally around a format, Yeah,
possibly. It's just the case that I think a lot of NVIDIA's business model is about being at the forefront of this sort of thing, when arguably maybe it should be Microsoft and DirectX and the consortium that should be actually doing that job and isn't.
Yeah. I think that's just from my personal opinion, Microsoft's been, I feel it's not so cool actually, is that they've been only using their Xbox as a way to drive DirectX forward. And it wasn't that way in the past. Like you look at like the 2006 to 2000 well, just anything up until around 2011. And kind of the driving forward area of DirectX was the PC environment. And then as soon as they really only started working with AMD in that aspect, it kind of became more like the new Xbox is the things that make actually functionality occur into DirectX, because we had DirectX Ultimate, which was basically a codification of the things that the Series X and Series S could do. So yeah,
interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's again, we're still in that sort of Wild West period where everything's up for grabs as we move into this sort of new paradigm for game graphics. It's hugely exciting, but it's very difficult to keep up with. But well, what can I say? Interesting stuff. Any thoughts on this, Oliver?
I think this is a really good standard to adopt for next generation console hardware, because it helps with a number of constraints you see on the console side. Like, it kind of feels very much like a piece of technology that's very useful there, because it could help a lot with memory bandwidth. And when we're talking about like 192-bit memory buses, a narrower memory bus, a big increase in the speed of the individual memory modules, but still not a very wide architecture. This could certainly help there. It could help with getting more efficient use out of memory, because we're probably not talking about a huge multiple increase over the size of the overall memory pool in the next generation consoles. We're probably talking about something more like a 50% bump, maybe at most a 100% bump. Not a gigantic increase, probably closer to that lower bound 50% bump there at 24 gigabytes or so. We're talking about obviously much better performance in scenes with very complex ray tracing, better performance in scenes that involve a lot of very highly complex, very complex assets that might be designed primarily for PCs, for higher end parts, might scale better to consoles here than the prior models would have scaled in last generation console software. So I think there's a lot of elements of this that could really be quite helpful for next generation consoles. And I think this is kind of one of the bedrock technologies that might define the next generation of console titles in the end here.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. I've got nothing more to add to that. I think you guys have covered out pretty well. I just think it's really interesting that, obviously the sort of initial takeaway, it's like, okay, it's another attempt to catch up to what NVIDIA is doing with, its publicized technologies, but there is actually more to the story. I think that's pretty great. It's kind of what we want to see at this point, because, you always sort of look to NVIDIA to see, the big things that are happening next, but it's great to see AMD taking point on this stuff as well.
Yeah, that's another take I would have at this, where with something like GGF, I think for a long period of time, AMD was just kind of like just doing the bare minimum almost from the outward perspective to support future technologies. And this is actually a direct attack at what the future is saying. It's saying like, actually, we're going to allow you to ray trace all that nanite geometry in real time. Maybe not right now, but in the future. And they're actually coming at the problem in a way that is different than the other vendors potentially would have come at it. So that is innovation in its own right, and definitely requires applause. It's actually a really cool idea.
Mm-hmm. Excellent stuff. Okay, let's move on to our next news topic. Alex, we need to talk about this.
Oh, yeah.
Ashes of the Singularity. In Ashes of the Singularity 2, there is a trailer. I'm not sure I've learned much about the game, but
no.
We've got to applaud these guys for what they do, really.
Yeah, so Ashes of the Singularity 2. There is not much known about the game by watching that trailer, I would say. But the name and the fact that it's a sequel, and we have a good understanding of what these developers have made in the past with all of their games, and then we can see what the original Ashes of Singularity was. I'm imagining we're going to see something just even bigger and better. The sequel, standard sequel thing, bigger and better than the original. And that is exciting for me because I'm a big fan of real-time strategy games in general. I've never been so big actually on the large-scale conflict games that have like ridiculous scale. Like for me, I do like Supreme Commander. Don't forget, I do like that game. But it was always a little bit hard for me to manage personally some of the larger aspects of it, because it is just darn colossal, the scale you get in those kind of games. From a visual and rendering tech perspective, they have always done amazing things. And the Ashes of the Singularity at the time did so many things for the PC platform, I would say, that should not be understated. They were one of the original embracing companies and developers of low-level APIs on PC, starting originally with our good friend Mantle. That was subsequently abandoned. But they moved then into Vulkan and the DirectX 12, and even had a DirectX 11 path for a long time. So you could see the differences, specifically in draw call performance, was what they were really attacking there. And they even had like incredible numbers that were just a lot of fun to play with. The benchmark for Ashes of the Singularity was basically, not to fault the game, but it was the game for a lot of people for a long period of time. And I really loved that. And another really cool thing, like they also pioneered some rendering tech that you didn't typically see and really haven't seen since then. The game, with its multiple scales, like you can just zoom in and out really far, it presents a lot of challenges for aspects of things like anti-aliasing and how do you solve textures and shading at different, for so many moving objects, as well as at different scales of how far you are from the object. That could end up being really expensive, the shading in its own right, as well as visually could be very noisy. And I think they moved for a unique texture space shading approach to rendering that gave them clean, anti-aliased graphics at a cost. It was heavy, I would say, on the GPU at an initial launching time. But it was a wholly unique way of doing rendering. And the last time I remember seeing anything about texture space shading before that was actually with like Crysis's DX10 edge anti-aliasing that it had.
Right.
That was a very strange thing that they did for the original Crysis, and seeing them take it up and do something very different with it. Since then, there hasn't actually, as far as I know, been much in that direction. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wholly wrong. But I thought that was so cool. And then, afterward, I think they wrote blogs about how they wanted to move away from low-level APIs because the upkeep for them was so insane.
Right.
So they moved, I guess, back to kind of like DX11 land. And we'll actually have to see. I have not taken a look at any of their games for a while now, unfortunately, because I've been covering so many other things, and the RTS games I've been playing have been different. But I'm really excited to see what the heck Ashes of the Singularity 2 means for PCs in general, because they've also scaled. One thing that made Ashes so cool is it was like one of the best scalers for showing like 8-core performance at a time when it wasn't so common. And it was one of those games where you'd be playing at 1080p or higher and still be CPU limited. And I found that fun.
Yes.
And it was justified too. The game was doing a lot, So
it scaled beyond 8 cores, I think.
Yeah.
Went into like 12 cores and beyond even, I think. I was just looking at the Steam page. It's got system requirements, Alex, and they're extraordinarily low.
Yeah,
the minimum is like a Ryzen 5 2400G, which is like a first generation APU from Ryzen there, which is kind of nuts. And their recommended spec, I mean, check this out: a Ryzen 5 3600 or an Intel i5 6400. So I'm kind of like, sure, this isn't for Ashes of the Singularity 1 at this point. I mean, that's kind of how nuts that is looking there.
That is impressive, actually.
So, but, I am hoping for another one of those benchmarking situations like the original Ashes, because I think it was the case where they just threw in like, hundreds, thousands of units. And the key to just stress testing the processor is that none of those units died. Mm-hmm. They just, no matter what happened, they would just persist and just hammer the CPU. And you saw some outrageous results there and scaling results there as they just upped the unit count. And we loved it, I think the other thing, of course, is that, Mantle, DirectX 12, Vulkan, all of those APIs came along, and there wasn't really any kind of real-world game stress tests for those APIs when they emerged. But,
right.
Dan Baker and the team at Oxide there, they just like came out with implementations very, very quickly. So you could actually get this like tantalizing taste of the future there.
Yeah.
So Ashes of the Singularity 2. I'm there for it.
Mm-hmm.
What can I say? Interesting stuff.
Yeah, I'm excited.
I'm not sure you had too much interaction with this franchise, Oliver.
No, my primary point of interaction, kind of like you mentioned here, is by reading benchmarks on Tom's Hardware or on Nantech that used Ashes as a benchmark game for, it feels like practically
the longest
better part of a decade.
6 to 8 years easily.
Yeah. It just was a huge. I mean, it could thrash GPUs and CPUs, and it was DX12, and it was just such an incredible benchmark. People used it for a very long time. But here, in terms of the additions to this game, they're adding humans, which sounds like an interesting kind of challenge with all those skin meshes at they're talking about 100,000 units or something. That's pretty crazy. They're talking about
cool.
Terrain deformation here as well, which is interesting. Should be very cool. But yeah, I mean, the surprising thing is that even in light of the increase in unit count, the increase in complexity, the human race here, the system requirements, like you mentioned, Rich, are really low on the GPU side. They're also talking about RX 480s and GTX 970s and GPUs.
That's crazy, because those GPUs have got deprecated driver support. You won't get a new driver for your Vega 64 anytime soon.
Yeah. And it also, I mean, it probably also, maybe to not to Alex's excitement so much, but it probably doesn't suggest necessarily a maximization of new GPU technology, at least in terms of mesh shaders or ray tracing or any of those other headline features we would like to see sometimes in the PC platform. But it also suggests some pretty incredible scalability here, so I'm excited to see how that fares. This isn't the kind of game, obviously, you tend to see on weaker platforms. You'd probably only see this on PC because of the necessary kind of interface compromises that would be necessary to get it on other platforms. So I'm excited to see how this one turns out, especially with those, massive 10,000, 100,000, whatever entity fights. That just sounds like a great deal of fun.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, again, Palpatine style, we'll be following it with great interest. But let's move on. Final news story of the week, and I guess we just wanted to pick up on some things that have been happening in terms of the world of platform holders turning into multi-platform developers, etc., or maybe not. Last week we were going to talk about this, but we ran out of time. There was a job posting from Sony for a senior director of multi-platform and account management, and buried within the text they're talking about things like, hey, we're going to be supporting Steam, Epic Game Stores, Xbox, Nintendo, mobile, what's going on? And then I just sort of was reading this morning this headline on WCCF Tech. Sony executive confirms that PlayStation is moving away from the hardware business towards a platform business, which is totally at odds with the kind of messaging we've seen so far from PlayStation, which is enough to raise an eyebrow, Roger Moore style. Oliver, you've been looking into these comments. I think there is obviously change afoot, because this is, ultimately the gaming business is a dynamic, volatile market, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think, things are going to change, but not dramatically so, as some of these headlines might be sort of suggesting.
Yeah. I think that these statements are kind of not really that meaningful without context here. And I think when you look at this Sony job ad in particular, they could be talking about a lot of things. Sony already has games on Xbox, kind of famously. You obviously have Helldivers 2 coming out in just a couple of weeks here. You also have MLB The Show. They have titles on Nintendo platforms already. They have Lego Horizon Adventures on Nintendo platforms on the original Switch. So I think these comments in that job ad are really easily mappable onto their existing console strategy. I don't think it suggests anything in particular that's new. In terms of that kind of second story, in terms of the story about the SVP at Sony, his comments, I think it's really important to actually read what he's saying, because he's an SVP for Sony, not Sony Interactive. The question that he was being asked was not about their games business. It was about Bandai Namco and Sony's anime offerings, including Demon Slayer and other properties. And the specific phrasing of what he's saying is really about Sony's hardware business, i.e. their TV divisions, their cameras, versus their content business, which is what, in his terms, their community-based engagement businesses. The quote, across a 200-word odd response, he only mentions gaming once, right? So he's not really talking about gaming. He's talking about that contrast between their hardware-centric businesses to their more community-based engagement businesses, which involve the gaming platform in particular here. So I don't think that's necessarily about any shift in their hardware strategy, any shift in their software strategy necessarily. But I do think that over time, we're going to see Sony and Microsoft end up more often on the same side of the kind of business discussions than opposing sides of these kinds of discussions, and indeed in terms of their hardware positioning, because Sony is going to be shifting a lot of units on Xbox, not because of any particular shift in their strategy, but just through a continuation of their strategy, right? Because they're shipping games on PC. They're often shipping games with a 6-month lag, with a 1-year lag on PC. And those are their contemporary console-selling, console-shifting titles, like their Spider-Mans, their Helldivers. That was the day and date title. Lots of titles are arriving on PC at the moment. Their Ratchet and Clanks, their Horizons, titles like this, they're major titles here. And Microsoft is shifting a lot of units on PS5. They've kind of already given up the fight. So I would expect that in that light, especially in the light that Microsoft might not be shipping competitive console units next generation in terms of their price for their performance relative to Sony's console offerings, given the different incentives of those two entities. I think this console war, in terms of the Sony-Microsoft side of it at least, is something that's going to be depressed in terms of emphasis next generation. But I don't think that comes as a result of any kind of comments in a job advertisement or comments that are being made by a Sony SVP about Demon Slayer or Bandai Namco or something. I don't really think that's the source of this. I think it just comes from the natural dynamics of Microsoft basically saying, we're kind of out of this whole console game to some significant degree. We're out of the kind of console war to some significant degree. And then Sony kind of accommodating that shift on the one hand, and also separately their shift to a more kind of like PC second, PC as an also kind of PlayStation platform kind of way of distributing their games.
Yeah, I'm in entire agreement here. And I think the whole concept of a console war at this point is a construct on social media from enthusiast holdouts, so to speak. Because, well, let's take a look at the facts, right? Let's talk about the fact there's going to be a Call of Duty pack-in on a PlayStation console, right? That's kind of like just indicative of the fact that Microsoft and Sony are now actually business partners in a sense. You know, the fact that there's going to be a SKU of a PlayStation out there that has Call of Duty in it, which is, you know, a Microsoft property at this point. It's happening because it's mutually beneficial to both parties. It wouldn't have happened in the past when it was like the battle of the exclusives, and if you go back to when the announcement of the Activision Blizzard acquisition was happening, it was like, oh wow, this is all about Xbox exclusivity for Call of Duty. Actually, no, the exact opposite has happened. Secondly, the concept of all of these fantastic Xbox games moving on to PlayStation and finding incredible success. This is mutually beneficial to both businesses, right? Obviously, Xbox is getting a far bigger return on those games now. And secondly, platform fees. Sony is going to be making out like bandits on all of those game purchases. I mean, assuming it's the same sort of 70-30 cut that we kind of assume it is, this is millions of units that are being shifted on the PlayStation Store and on PlayStation discs, where Sony's basically taking a big fat cut of that. That's, they're effectively partners at this point, I would say. So, going back to that job ad where they're talking about, Xbox being a partner, I suspect it's going to go both ways simply because it has to. If Microsoft's approach is to basically align more with the PC space, which makes a lot of sense, right? Then, it's going to be incredibly difficult and indeed petty for Sony to stop PC games working on a PC just because it's affiliated with Xbox.
Right.
And at the same time, if the platform fees for the Xbox store or the Microsoft store are actually lower than they are on Steam, that's like a huge amount of additional money that Sony could make simply by embracing the Xbox marketplace. Just makes sense, right? I think, this whole sort of idea of, I mean, it's all about, it seems to be at the moment as to whether Sony's going to be adopting rather Microsoft's business strategy for Xbox. I don't think it is. in a number of crucial ways that you've pointed out, Oliver. I don't think they're going to be stopping their big AAA titles from coming out first on the PlayStation. But the point is that when it does come out on PC, it just makes a lot of sense to support Xbox, as it will be at that point, right? It's just kind of like everybody's a winner, really. Alex, what's your view on all of this?
I mean, it's always been a bit childish, but getting to nowadays where we see Microsoft with such a small portion of the overall console market as it currently stands, their position to pivot to fully third-party status, maybe with slight delays to when the Sony port comes, because there's actually there is a technical reason why it could take a little bit longer to port to their to their ecosystem and APIs and all that. But from Sony's side, if that main rival is gone and subsumed into the multi-platform market, then it makes sense to bring out to whatever platform they have in the future and just maximize units, because they're no longer any sort of existential threat. We'll see over time what it means in regards to how PC develops with the next gen of consoles coming out, see which part of the pie it takes now that Microsoft is going to have a PC kind of thing. It'll be interesting to see if that develops in a different direction. But for now, it's just more money.
Yeah, ultimately, that's the crucial factor for these mega big corporations, which always made the whole concept of fandoms, kind of interesting and a bit bizarre from that perspective. And also like your sort of dogged sort of following of like their financial statements. That's kind of weird, isn't it? Yeah, it's an odd sort of games specific phenomena, but it's kind of strange, but quite amusing at points. Anyway, that's kind of our take on that. So I think we should move on. Okay, so let's move on to supporter Q&A. This is the part of the show where every week we ask our supporters for their input into DF Direct Weekly. Obviously, things are a bit different now. So just to recap, Digital Foundry is now a fully independent creator-owned entity. We've parted ways with IGN. We've bought them out. And we're looking forward to a brand new era of being fully in control of our own destiny. There's a huge amount of stuff that we're looking into tentatively, which we talked about in a DF Direct special, which I'll link in the video description below. But we've obviously had some supporter questions about all of this. And we won't get through all of them, but these ones I thought were quite interesting. We're going to kick off with this one from Alan, the infamous, legendary Alan from the Discord. The workers have overthrown their corpo overlords! Exclamation point. The truth is, though, times are getting tougher. Too many people are trying to do the same thing. Big tech sucking the life out of independence, people wanting content for free, and now AI. What can us viewers do other than Patreon? How many of the viewers are not subscribed? Ideas for merch? It's a good question, really. I mean, ultimately, I think it's down to us to actually talk about the mechanisms of support. And if you look at channels like Gamers Nexus, they actually do that really well. They talk about their new merchandising. They talk about how supporting the team directly is directly connected to content, good content, quality content. And we have to do the same. And, we need to do a better job of telling people, hey, we are fully independent media. We are reliant to a certain extent, to a great extent, on your support. And we do need to talk more about the Patreon. I do think we need to be a bit more innovative in terms of merch in the way that Gamers Nexus has, because they've done some great stuff. Not to mention, the empire of merch that Linus Tech Tips has done. We can't do that, obviously. We haven't got the time. But, we can do better. And, I think it's just basically a case of stay tuned, really, to see what we get up to and how you can support the team. But, patreon.com/Digital Foundry is our primary form of support for now. And the whole process of independence and going forward with that, that's where I'm going to be posting all of our key updates so people can see what we're actually doing and how difficult it is behind the scenes to sort of do certain stuff, but basically take you along on the journey with us. Let's move on to this question from Peter Karadimas. Happy Independence Day, DF crew! Exclamation point. Now you guys are completely in charge of your own destiny. What's your general view of sponsored content with the YouTube channel going forward? You stated in the past you won't be doing content like the Nintendo ad, but what are your thoughts on things like sponsored deep dives and partnership content with publishers? Interesting question, right? And I think there's a good way of doing it, and there's poor / suboptimal way of doing it. I think basically when the views of a sort of sponsor align with stuff that we're passionate about doing, then you get something really, really decent. And let's talk about your video you just done with NVIDIA there, Alex, on Doom, where it was basically something which I thought was just completely fascinating. It was to go back in time and to visit a pivotal point in PC gaming and to celebrate major advances in graphics. At the same time, kind of like also towards the end of the timeline there, talking about how innovation has changed, evolved, what's new with the current generation, using the Doom franchise as like a touchstone of sorts.
Yeah, that's kind of how I see it, because I've always been passionate about how games run at the time period of when they came into being, and then like what they brought to the table that was new visually or otherwise. And I feel like that is an area of sponsored content that I'm very comfortable with, and there are ideas that freely flow out of my brain without prompting. So there's two angles to sponsored content. The way it kind of happens is you get approached and they say, we want to do something, and this is the specific thing. And then you're kind of brainstorming about what you want to do with it, because maybe they align with your vision, but you're not sure what you want to do. But for here, NVIDIA was like, we want to talk about Doom. And I was like, okay, this is how I would want to talk about Doom if I ever wanted to talk about it. And that was, it was liberating at the same time as it was a great way to channel my creativity and the things that I was really interested in. And in the end, everyone was happy with it, I think, from all parties' perspectives. And that is a direction I would really like to take sponsored content in the future. It wouldn't necessarily be so large. That was a pretty long video. But, the idea of where I would talk to a publisher who has a series of games or even a new game coming out that aligns with visions of, the latest and greatest in, gaming technology, past, present, and future. If it aligns with that vision of DF and my personal vision, then I would totally do it. And I would approach it to a very similar way to that video. And that could include hardware and software. So that's what I would really like to do. And definitely not a repost of an ad on the main channel.
Yeah. I mean, obviously that wasn't great. But at the same time, the thing that I liked about the Doom video is that I think there's kind of like a constant revisionism of the glorious past of PC gaming. And it's natural that if you're going to be making like tremendous leaps and bounds in visual fidelity, guess what? It's got a performance cost. That is true today, and it was true yesterday. And what you actually showed in that video, which I thought was quite interesting, is that there's actual technologies in place to attempt to mitigate the impact of those performances. But the thing that amused me the most was the fact that Doom, the original Doom, had an upscaler. Horizontal upscaler.
Yes, it did. It's so funny. You go back and like everyone just remembers Doom from the iconic images, but if you played it back, and the thing is, I got a lot of feedback after the video from people who love retro computing, and they were very happy that I showed it as is. But a lot of people were saying, Alex, you showed a 486, and that was still super expensive at the time period. I played the game on a 386, and my goodness, that was a small window. So it's even more, I presented the best of the best for the most part, and rose tinted the comparison at that point, because I wasn't showing like maybe the average mainstream. And another thing that I love that you just described, that this kind of I don't know if it's a romanticization or if it's a changing of the way things actually were, but a lot of people really do think for a certain period of time that the best PC games just ran at like 1080p 60 no matter what. Yeah. And like I'm already seeing it with Battlefield 6 coming out. There's a long scale narratives about how EA DICE games run, and that all the things I read out there are wrong. Like almost all of them are wrong. Like you go back, Battlefield 3 was like destroying PCs if you had the settings up, like it could scale so far into the future. Yeah. Or even go back to Battlefield 2. You couldn't play the game on the highest settings with less than 1 gigabyte of RAM. That was like 3 gigs of RAM back then, or 2 was like $500 to $700 US. Like you gotta really perspectivize some of this stuff. So I would love to do more of that.
Yeah, I think just to sort of sum up the sponsored content side of things, we've got to rebalance the business because, you look at all of the PC tech channels and all of them have some sort of monetization element beyond Google AdSense. It can be just a quick ad, for example, burnt in, Gamers Nexus do this, Hardware Unbox do this. There's a lot going on there that's just, stuff that we kind of done. We've done a few MSI things in the past, but we've not really done anything beyond that. But what I do think is important is still that, if you are a supporter, you've got access to like ad-free versions of everything we do, which is something which is, I think goes down well. But, we are going to be talking to people about, just revamping the whole commercial side of the business, because ultimately we've laid out our stall in terms of what we want to do. But we got to pay for it, right? And that's going to, basically involve, additional support. Now we're fully independent, which I've got to say, I'm just blown away by the response on Patreon. So thank you so much to that. But, we want to pay people what they're worth, good money. So that's, we've got to basically diversify the business and increase revenues elsewhere in ways that are kind of acceptable, and sponsored content that we love to do. Ad inserts, I don't have a problem with those. But, stuff like, just dropping trailers onto the channel, that obviously didn't work. Learned the lesson and moved on. Quick question here from Matt Birchler. Hello, exclamation point. Absolutely love the work you all do. So happy for you embarking on this new era. I'm curious if there are any benefits to being owned by someone else that you'll miss now you're indie, things like cross promotion or technical infrastructure that you need to handle yourself. Cheers, exclamation point. Just quickly answer that. Yes, having a company that just handles payroll and taxes and everything for you, that is like incredibly valuable, because the whole point, one of the whole essences of why we did this joint venture with Gamer Network back in the day is they had all of that taken care of, and it's like, we'll take care of this, you take care of the content. And that was in the time where Gamer Network itself was an independent company, and kind of there was great alignment in terms of what we set out to achieve. That kind of changed once the Gamer Network was sold to Reed Exhibitions, this like massive company. At that point, it kind of became the case that there were a lot more disadvantages than advantages. And obviously, the way things are now, we've got rid of that, but we do need to sort all of that stuff. Let's go on to this question. Mr. Bespoke. Hi, DF Gents. Now that Digital Foundry is now, quote unquote, completely independent, will Alex be making an escape attempt from his undisclosed location and his captors? Thanks, and keep up the awesome independent work. This prompted a response from Give Me More Fame, mate. At least they allowed him to hang up some pictures. Yeah,
I was about to say, we're upgrading here in the prison cell. But actually, seriously though, the reason why I've been put it this way is because behind the scenes details, I moved essentially where my workstation setup was to a room in my house where currently the bed I sleep in is, because we are moving. It's not a house. I live in an apartment. Who am I kidding? But we're kind of moving the bed to the different room where I previously used to work from. And this room is being converted into a kind of work room and also a place where you can lounge a little bit. And that has been long because, it's kind of hard to find the time to rip out wallpaper and redo an entire room while you work and do all these other things in real life. So, so that's why it's taken some time. And that's why I'm unfortunately focusing on this little tiny area right here between my windows of the front of my house. So it'll change hopefully in the next 3 to 4 weeks.
The final question from Joe Esposito here. Hello, newly independent DF team, ! Now that you're running solo of Outside Control, what do each of you look forward to most as you enter this new chapter? Congratulations! ! It's interesting, this concept of outside control. I think it's more, it's fairer to say that it was outside influences, because editorially we've always done what we do, right? It's not really any sort of directives from above or anything like that. It's more of the case that let's just say that business strategies for a gigantic multinational, obviously they're in place for a reason. Are they the best strategies for a bunch of 5 people working out of their homes? Possibly not. But Oliver, what do what's the sort of thing that you're looking forward to going forward?
I mean, personally, I've always been very happy with my little slice of Digital Foundry, mostly covering console games and things like that. I don't expect that will change a whole lot here, but I'm hoping that with this move we'll be less under pressure, maybe to keep costs in check, and that we can operate without like really hard cost pressures. In particular, I was kind of, personally concerned about everyone else in the team when like there were, different kinds of cost cutting measures, different kinds of redundancies in place and under prior management in the organizations that we were part of. So I'm hoping that those kinds of concerns will mostly be allayed, especially if we get, especially if people continue to participate and continue to contribute to Digital Foundry in the way that we'd like to see. So I hope that kind of concern will largely go away relative to kind of where we were at before.
Yeah. I don't think we need to worry about that, because there is a foundational business there that obviously I've spent a lot of money buying shares of, and if it wasn't really, if it wasn't a good business, I wouldn't be doing so.
Yeah.
So rest assured, when you've got massive companies making layoffs, that is obviously worrying. But at the same time, when you've got your own little individual business unit, there's very little that can actually impact us. It's more, what can I say? Just give you a classic example here. Our prior partners, part owners, if you like, before Reed Exhibition, before IGN was Reed Exhibitions, ReedPop, pandemic comes along, and suddenly you're an events company that can't run events anymore. The whole company kind of goes into survival mode, and a whole sort of range of blanket policies are deployed. Like pay freezes, for example. And, obviously there were some layoffs at the time. If you are an events company that has gigantic overheads and cannot run events, I understand completely why this sort of stuff would happen, right? At the same time, if you're kind of like a part of that company, but at the same time, the pandemic doesn't really impact your business at all. In fact, people at home meant more people were watching videos, right? Why are we even being included in that kind of conversation?
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't. There's a lot of things that business strategies for different businesses are obviously there for a reason, but we are a different business. We want to chart our own course. We aren't affected by all of this stuff, so we don't really want that kind of outside influence to have any kind of bearing on what we do. So that's just kind of like one example from back in the day where this would never have happened under the original Gamer Network, because it was tightly focused on the creative element. That's why it was successful. Anyway, I guess that's all we've pretty much got to say. Question, Q&A wise on the business at the moment. But let's move on to other questions. Okay, this question comes from I Pay in BRL. Hello, all the way from Brazil. exclamation point. I remember a while ago, Steam shared some information about the most used GPUs on their platform and that laptops had an interesting number. Have you considered reviewing games on various laptops? How different of a workflow do you think it would be to produce such a video? Congratulations on your Independence Day! Exclamation point. Much love from Brazil. Yes, it's an interesting point, Alex, isn't it? Because all of the information that we've kind of gleaned over the years is that the proliferation of gaming laptops is just getting higher and higher. You can look at the Steam hardware survey now, and laptop 4060 is up there with desktop 4060. That's shifting like an incredible amount of units now. And I think it's the case that a lot of the younger audience are getting into gaming either through mobile or through gaming laptops, right? Which brings them into the PC ecosystem, which is great. But it presents a number of challenges in terms of reviews, right?
Yeah, so you just have to look at the way we do reviews for a product. I'll just pick out a GPU right now. Let's say the RTX 5060. We plug that RTX 5060 typically into an extremely large CPU rig, 9800X3D, something like that. And we just run all the benches at various resolutions. And we say the card runs at this wattage. It gets this frame per watt. It gets, all these things. And then since we have a baseline 9800X3D that we've ran all the other GPUs in that are put out, we can throw that into a graph and you can say, this is how it ran one next to the other. And this can inform your purchasing decision. You cannot do that with a laptop because the laptop is soldered onto a board, usually the GPU next to a CPU, and the CPU could be limiting your performance, and you can't get this like great raster grid comparison to other products in similar categories. You start having to look at this thing more holistically, and comparisons to other products are not so straightforward. That's good because it actually probably does align more with DF's vision of talking about experiential gaming, in some level, I would say, more than the bar charts. But at the same time, it makes the actual review itself extremely arduous. And I'm not exactly sure what data points you go to at that point in time, because one RTX 4060 or 5060 from one laptop manufacturer may actually have a different wattage and thermal threshold and throttling issues that another one wouldn't have. And at that point, you're not even talking about the 5060 anymore. You're talking about some other thing. Some of this does go back into NVIDIA's and AMD's reluctance to bring back things like the RTX 5060 Go. They should really do that.
There's a lot of things, isn't there, Alex? For example, the wattage that a GPU is given in a laptop. A 56. I've got we actually did an HP Omen sponsored video about this that had a 65 watt 4070, right? And that 65 watt 4070 isn't representative of every 4070 laptop out there, even if they all had the same CPU, because it's power limited, and obviously in a slim and light chassis, it could be thermally limited. So where do you start? Do you have like some sort of representative laptop? It's difficult, right? Because every single laptop out there could be different. The power advantage, you could have like a 130 watt 4070 versus the other 65 watt one I looked at. In that case, you're looking at scenarios where your laptop 4070 could be faster than a laptop 4080 if it's running at a much lower wattage. It's kind of crazy there. It's really difficult to actually make an informed review about running a game on a certain piece of hardware when there's so many different combinations of hardware there. Oliver, you used to actually have a PC gaming laptop, right?
I did, and I ran into this problem a little bit with trying to extract where's the relative performance of my computer relative to this game. And I think the solution there, I had a mobile RTX 3080, was basically just to look up the numbers for the desktop RTX 3060 Ti. Because usually they'd map on fairly well. So I'd suggest that as the solution here. In particular, because let's say we did sample a representative range of laptops to test for new games, right? That would be a pretty colossal undertaking for all the reasons that Alex suggested. But that's also just 5 individual laptops, right? Whereas if we're covering a kind of part, in the PC space, in the desktop PC space, any given RTX 5070 is going to behave about as well, plus or minus 10% with any other RTX 5070. Whereas the same situation in a laptop, you could be dealing with different TDPs, you could be dealing with different kinds of throttling behavior, you could be dealing with different kinds of fan curves, you could be dealing with different kinds of thermal paste applications, you could be dealing with all kinds of different problems. And also laptops are much more prone, in my experience, especially gaming laptops, to breaking down and suffering from issues. So now all of a sudden you've introduced this extra element, which I'm sure Alex is very, very well acquainted with, which is you're doing a kind of PC review or PC type review, and you're running into issues with the game settings or the operating system or the behavior of the device that you're using that's operating in unexpected ways. And all of a sudden you're spending a day, half a day chasing down random issues with this laptop that is just like totally unproductive time in terms of producing a video. So it's just challenging for a number of reasons, right?
It doesn't happen so much anymore, but there's also somebody who come out with a driver update that like increases performance like 20%.
Yeah,
that used to be the case, like with AMD drivers with OpenGL games. There'd be a lot of hilarity around that with driver updates. I think Doom 2016 is probably a classic example of that. Yeah, I mean, what can I say? Gaming laptops, hugely important, very tricky to actually cover in game reviews, I think. Let's move on. This question comes from Octolima. I've been thinking about the Switch 2 having a 1080p screen, as to whether it's an overall positive or negative. The pros are that handheld can have better image quality depending on the game, but the cons include a hit to battery life, the potential for worse performance in games that target 1080p over a lower 720p, and worse scaling for lower res games that output at 720p. However, the argument could also be made that by forcing developers to shoot for 1080p in handheld, paves the way for a better 1080p plus resolution experience in dock play. What are your thoughts on this? Would a 720p 120Hz display have been a better choice, or is it fine as is? Well, Oliver, as a ROG Ally enjoyer, which does have, actually that does have a 1080p 120Hz screen, doesn't it? It's
That's
not
correct.
really lower resolution, but the size of that screen is such that it doesn't really matter if you're playing at 720p.
No, I'd certainly suggest that with something like a device like this, something like a device like a ROG Ally or a Steam Deck, I would overall prefer a 720p panel, but I do think there are arguments either way. With the Switch 2 in particular, most games are reaching a pixel match with the 1080p display in one respect or another, and the games that can't and are only going to 720p, like a game like Street Fighter 6, usually look fine because they're upscaled in a fairly elegant way on that panel. There are some exceptions like the Hitman collection that are not so well upscaled to reach that higher resolution panel, but mostly it's pretty much fine with the current selection of titles. I think it's potentially more of an issue for current generation titles that are more demanding, and it's also like a little bit annoying on the device that Switch 1 software doesn't scale all that well to the Switch 2's panel very often, especially with games that aren't using like TAA or post-AA even, that are kind of upscaling that pretty raw looking output that still looks pretty good on a Switch 1 because it is a precise pixel match. It does not look so well on a Switch 2, unfortunately. So yeah, I can see arguments either way, but I could also see it being the case that, having the 1080p panel gives the developers an option to increase resolution in a way that's compelling on Switch 2 for cross-gen software for games that are being updated for Switch 2. And I also do agree that 1080p target makes games scale a little bit more elegantly to 4K, where instead of maybe targeting 1080p with a 720p target in handheld mode, you're targeting like 1440p, a little bit higher resolution. So I think in general, for devices like the ROG Ally, for devices like the Steam Deck, for devices like the Switch 2, I would prefer a 720p panel, 720p class panel. I think it's the more elegant scaling target. But in terms of the Switch 2 in particular, I can actually see the 1080p target being fairly realistic for a wide range of titles in a way that I wasn't really expecting pre-launch as much.
What about the size of the screen in relation to like pixel density? Do you think that, if we'd had 720p at that large screen on the Switch 2, it would have been a bit poor in terms of image quality?
I can definitely see the difference, not so much for 3D content. I don't think it makes a huge difference for a lot of games' 3D content. If the game is using effective anti-aliasing, if the game has effective upscaling, I don't think it makes a huge difference. But it's more the 2D content that I tend to notice is a big issue. In a game like Metaphor ReFantazio on the Steam Deck, that is a game that looks pretty pixelated and raw relative to a title like Metaphor ReFantazio on a ROG Ally. And indeed, that 7.9-inch panel, you might not think it's that much bigger, but it's like 28% larger than a 7-inch panel, which is the size of the Steam Deck OLED's panel. So I do think there's a compelling argument to say that Nintendo needed to do something about screen resolution, probably needed to do something about screen resolution to justify that upgrade. In the end, it does come with trade-offs, which is what makes it a little bit trickier. Now, on the Sony side of things, with their next generation PlayStation handheld, I'm sure that will service the 1080p panel very capably, right? It's just a question for these lower power devices where I think it's a little bit shakier.
Yeah. What do you think, Alex?
I mean, everyone knows how much I love the Switch 2.
Yeah, of course.
And that's number one. Number two, I think pre-launch, I was definitely of the mind, and I think I said it multiple times, and I think I've also said it regarding the Steam Deck's successor, that I am fine with it staying lower resolution. I think I've said that in the past as well, too, where I felt like scaling resolution at smaller screen size in the palm of your hand is a lot less beneficial than scaling features at a lower resolution, which is how I felt about game graphics actually for a long period of time. So here I actually would have been a big fan of a 720p panel, but Oliver's points are very good there regarding like scaling of previous content as well as future content and whatever the Switch successor is going to be capable of. And so I feel like this is actually a hard thing to make a big really big statement that I would prefer one or the other on. The only thing that really does annoy me, though, is that we are kind of still only talking about this because we have fixed pixel displays. And I almost wish there was some magical technology that prevented this, because we spend so much time trying to avoid upscaling, as in linear upscaling, to our displays, and we invent entire technologies around it instead of just coming out at the problem from a different angle. So, but that is something we cannot solve. So
you're basically advocating for a CRT handheld.
A CRT handheld, someone can do it.
It's the future. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. This one comes from Simon M. Hi, just subscribed to Patreon in the wake of your wonderful news! Thank you so much. That's awesome. My question is that Nintendo seems to be putting out a lot of customer surveys around their Switch 2 quote-unquote cartridges, e.g. game key cards, codes in boxes, and actual game carts. What do we make of this? Are they actually going to change their mind on the spread of codes and key cards over actual carts? Or is this kind of survey just standard market research? Thanks. This is kind of in the wake of news that there is a survey going around. It's been widely shared on social media that invites people to comment on, how attached they are to social media, what they think of the controversial game key card, the code in a box phenomena, and so forth. Oliver, you actually filled in that survey, right?
I did fill in this survey. Well, I posted as a bit of a joke in a channel I'm part of in a different organization that I'd filled out the option to say that I preferred the game key cards, just to mess up the results slightly.
What?
But no, I didn't send it in. I collected it, but I didn't send it in. I do think Nintendo is potentially looking at expanding the number of capacities they offer, and I think they are trying to see what customers want in terms of the game keycard option, in terms of the coding box option, in terms of the actual physical 64 gigabyte cart option. And I do think that multiple capacities are in the cards. In particular, there's a statement from Macronix, who currently supplies Switch 2 carts, and they said they were going to mix MLC and 3D NAND to meet varying capacity requirements, which implies maybe a greater range of NAND capacities that would be available in Switch 2 cards. But I do suspect that smaller carts, depending on how this has been implemented, they might have slower speeds. So there might be a pretty steep trade-off there between having this lower capacity card that might have fewer channels available for data transfer and having those larger capacity cards that are a little bit more capacious and a little bit faster as well. And Nintendo notably doesn't offer an option, kind of like Sony did, or rather kind of like Microsoft did with the 360, to install games from the cards to kind of sidestep this issue. We've seen repeatedly across multiple pieces of software that there are worse load times in Switch 2 cartridge software than in GameCube card software, or indeed download software. Obviously, those are equivalent. So I would say be careful a little bit what you wish for with these with this potential for multiple capacities and indeed increased game cartridge adoption here, because there are definite trade-offs, not just in terms of cost for the publisher and potentially cost for the end user, but in terms of the actual speed of that media.
Right, that's a good point. I hadn't even thought of that, but it makes perfect sense, right? I mean, I guess the way it works is that having that large capacity means that there are kind of more channels to the chip. Make the chip smaller, you get fewer channels, which reduces loading time, increases loading times rather, which is, shall we say, a suboptimal result. I am still baffled by the concept that only a 64 gigabyte Switch 2 cartridge was made available, because that's not going to be cheap, right? And you'd think there would be more options, and you'd think it would have been thought of in terms of the foundational design of the cartridge long before it came to market. I guess it's not really a problem with a Blu-ray disc, which is always going to have like 50 or 100 gigs or whatever. But when you're dealing with proper cartridges like this, it's a completely different story. Right. Yeah, it's tricky. I hadn't really thought about that, but absolutely makes sense. Well, let's move on to our final question of the show. This one comes from Todd Weitzel. In the search for new business opportunities, has Digital Foundry considered using its considerable expertise at image analysis to enter the lucrative market of conspiracy theories, such as the Zapruder film, proving the Earth is flat, the moon not being real? That's a new one on me. Or mountains being tree trunks left over from when aliens chopped them all down.
What? That's the newest one. I've heard of all the others.
Even the moon not existing?
Yeah, I actually met a guy once who thought
really
the moon was
okay.
Yeah, wow. I unfortunately did. Yeah.
Well, we do have a particular set of skills, but I don't think it's going to be particularly effective at analyzing the images to fuel conspiracy theories. But I have often thought in the past, what if Digital Foundry used its powers for evil? We could certainly back in the day, there was a lot of like leaked specs for consoles that came out that you just took a quick look at it and knew it was BS, right? You knew there was nothing to it. It was total nonsense. But there was nobody out there that was actually coming up with convincing leaks for next generation consoles that could actually be viable, that could gain momentum. And, you could basically prank the entire industry at that point. Obviously, we wouldn't want to attach our name to it, but, anonymous leaks, that sort of thing. The sort of mirror universe, which was definitely up for that. Oliver, Digital Foundry conspiracy theories, what do you think?
Oh, is there a market for this? I mean, in terms of doing it convincingly, I think there are good YouTube channels that do analysis of this kind of things, different kinds of debunkings based off of video, media, audio.
Well, this is reverse debunking, isn't it? This is about proving all of these crazy things to be true.
yeah, that's the problem. I guess this would be in the inverse. But I think we could definitely use our skills for this kind of task, but I think in terms of trying to make a case that something is real or not real, you're really looking at very minute phenomena. And I think game graphics aren't quite at that level where there's no real dispute over whether an image from the latest Battlefield is a real image or not. People understand intuitively that it's not. I think that operating on this kind of extension is probably something that I feel like someone could do more credibly if they were working in a really high-end CG productions, potentially. That kind of thing. And indeed, perhaps in creating some of this information in the first place to try to sell as true information.
Well, I'll tell you what, Alex, clearly the business case going forward is that we need to enter the grifting arena. We need to do
grifters.
Some grifting. What do you think?
I think I could do an amazing grassy knoll analysis. I think, I've got the skills for that at least.
Would there be less grass on the grassy knoll on the Series S version?
I mean, one of these days when we actually have time. So a couple years back, John and Audie did an amazing April Fool's video that wasn't an April Fool's video. It's actually a good video. It's actually a lot of fun. But then we've done, I think, silly videos in between now and then occasionally. But I actually would love to do a real silly April Fool's video. I don't think we'd go straight to the moon isn't real for that video, but something that is a bit making fun of what we do is always actually good. So This is a wonderful idea, by the way. Great question.
That video you're talking about, it's well worth checking out. Biomutant When, I think, is the was the sentiment behind that, and it was fun just to sort of see that sort of take place. And it was the case where it was like, okay, let's do like an 8,000% zoom, and then I would say, and let's add the Inception horn on top of it. That was great, wasn't it?
That was really good.
Yeah, we should do a bit more lighthearted stuff when the occasion arises. But man, grifting conspiracy theories. What can I say?
I guess that another problem is conspiracy theories aren't so funny anymore. I think in the 90s when you were there with like X-Files, it was kind of like entertaining, but now it's a little bit scary with AI and everything in the mix, Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There'll be an AI Zapruder.
Yeah, do it. Why not?
Okay, well, that was the last question there for the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share on the off chance that you enjoyed it. Ring bells for notifications for you, potential algorithmic boosts for us. As always, though, I mean, DF supporter program, obviously, we're really talking about that now. We're fully independent. And it's a crucial part of making sure we're able to do what we do and to grow and expand the team. That's kind of what we want to do. Do more great stuff. But that's all from us this week. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry. We'll see you next week. Thank you.